Start your session and please go ahead.
Yeah. So thank you for having us. And yeah.
Yeah, so we're here to talk a bit about artificial biodiversity, which can seem like a bit of a general topic, but we'll try and keep it short. Honestly, a lot of our work sort of starts with a question or several questions, but one of them really is more on the philosophical end, is what is beautiful, and where, especially when we're working with all these different technologies, what is it that makes them, the images that come out and the models that come out, what makes them beautiful? I mean, is it the composition? Is it the arrangement of elements? In this case, is it the arrangement of elements that the machine has managed to find here, or the algorithms rather? Is that what's beautiful? Is it the data set itself? Because when we're talking about neural networks, as I'm sure you've all have heard already, is we have to provide the neural network with a data set to be trained upon. And is it the beauty of the data set that leads to the beauty of the final piece? Is that it?
Like a beautiful data set makes for a beautiful output, basically. And would beauty be a high-level feature?
Exactly. Or is the beauty more low level? Is it the arrangements of numbers? You know, you have for each color image, you have 3 color channels, red, green, and blue, and each pixel has a value for each of these channels from 0 to 255. Is that it?
It's kind of a strange moment when you zoom into an image and realize that what you're looking at is actually pixels, because it kind of dissolves, and all the semantic that our brains are able to pick up suddenly vanish when we look at what the image is actually made of.
Or is it the process itself? Is it the process of training a model, of that, in a sense, uncertainty, unknowing, as the network trains and learns from the data set that you've provided? Is that some of the beauty? Are we closer to performance than to perhaps painting?
And I mean, there could be a kind of meditative aspect to working with machine learning too, because sometimes when we have to wait, I mean, we've trained networks where we had to wait for a month. Now we have to wait less and less, of course, with better hardware, but still there's something kind of a process, or yeah, like the idea evolves and changes in the meantime within that month. And there's something interesting about that workflow.
Yeah, and especially you could also ask, is the beauty actually in the function of the neural network itself, which is modeled upon neurons in the brain? Is it that each of these virtual neurons takes some kind of input from the dataset, processes it, and it's the interaction between layer upon layer of neurons that is it that, in a sense, machine performance rather than artist performance that is wherein the beauty stems? And the reason we're talking about beauty, which is really quite an abstract concept, is that for us, both as artists, a lot of our practice falls under the umbrella of creating meditations, and our topic especially is nature. And for each, in a sense, for each neural network we train, we have an input, a data set, and we feed that into the neural network and wait, and then we have an output, which we then can explore. And this act of curating a data set, of inputting it, training and outputting it, has a lot in common with meditating upon a topic. There's a lot of the same mechanisms that, you know, that can compare.
So one of the things that, at least from my own personal experience, has led me to be fascinated by working with neural networks is the fact that they let me extract patterns, and I don't have to do that manually. So there's kind of an active process in it where I'm able to use a program that extracts things for me, and that kind of becomes stimulating in a, yeah. So I guess that something that I really like to share when I give talks is that when I was 5 years old, I had this experience with jellyfish that kind of marked me and created, not created, but kind of stemmed a phobia of jellyfish. And eventually, as I became an adult, that turned into an artistic fascination with the textures of jellyfish. And as I began working with machine learning algorithms, one of the first things I wanted to do was create synthetic jellyfish by extracting patterns of jellyfish from a data set. And that led me to kind of question as well my own brain. How did I arrive to wanting to make art with the topic of jellyfish? And what data set was I given about jellyfish in to my biological neurons? So something that kind of challenges me is when I try to imagine a color that I've never seen before. And I really like what goes on to the process of trying to imagine something that's that we know is there, but that is inimaginable for us, given that we're only able to perceive a certain and limited amount of the color spectrum. And I'm always very jealous of mantis shrimp and the fact that they have around 12 to 16 photoreceptors, and we only have 3. And all the color combinations that we see come from those 3. So I really, embarrassingly enough, I spend lots of time thinking about what are all those colors that I can't see, and why am I limited to the data set of colors that I'm able to perceive and that I have seen. So I guess this kind of ties up on the question of what can artificial neural networks teach us about our own cognitive processes, and what do we as humans learn from having to teach a computer how to do something? There's always something that we learn from teaching. And I think, I'm sure that all of you, at least who have teaching experience, could agree that we learn things better when we have to teach them to someone. And I think that there's something that we are learning about ourselves by having to teach a computer how to process data and make sense of data in a way that also makes sense to us and to what we see. So this could boil down to the mission of extracting the visual essence of a jellyfish, which I could say jellyfishness in itself, and how to visualize natureness. What is the concept of natureness? What does it look like? Because it's something abstract that my brain can kind of make sense of what natureness is, but it would be hard to say, okay, this picture looks like nature, this one doesn't, and where does a picture begin to have natureness in it, and where does it end? What's that threshold? And on this particular topic, a paper that really inspired me is the paper by Aaron Hertzman of Visual Indeterminacy in GAN Art. And one of the things that I really like about it is that he takes examples that are made by artists by hand, like oil on canvas, so non-generative artists. And that kind of shows us that visual indeterminacy was already something before even we were able to use generative algorithms to create a visually indeterminate image. So there's something about the promise, the visual promise of something. I really like this sentence in particular from the paper. It says, in short, visual indeterminacy occurs in a seemingly meaningful visual stimulus that denies easy or immediate identification. It is the lack but promise of semantic stability. So this, in particular, this lack but promise of semantic stability, it's like something is missing from the image, but simultaneously the image itself is promising something, and that kind of triggers a cognitive mechanism that that in a way has something fascinating to it.
Yeah, and I think honestly, we're not really that interested in machine learning for the sake of machine learning. And to tie it back to the question of beauty, I think when we are working with machine learning, we work within a very human sphere. We work with data sets that we either create or collect. For example, images. If you take a very common example is the flicker faces model, the GAN model, which is based upon 70,000 odd pictures of people taken from the internet. The thing is about these aren't just pictures of people, they're pictures of people taken by people. And that also tells us, when we now then see the output, something about what the people who took the image find aesthetics. So for us, when we work with nature and artificial life within the digital realm, it's not about necessarily always thinking of beauty as an untouched nature out there, but to see the beauty in our own representations of nature and our assumptions, visual assumptions of nature.
Yeah, so there's kind of a contradiction between what we learned is nature and what we learned is technology. That technology is supposed to be this thing that's completely separate from nature. And for that reason, if one wants to connect with nature, one should just leave all technology behind. And I think, well, at least I can speak for us that we view nature as a part of, we view technology as a part of nature. And human technologies are, as soon as humans are a part of nature, our own technologies also become a part of that same nature, not a separate one necessarily. So
when we bring digital life forth, when we create new digital creatures, are we somehow satisfying an egotistical sort of drive to procreate somehow, to give birth, to bring forth something human created, even though it is of a non-human subject? Is that it? That's at least a question we often ask ourselves.
Yeah, and so this pushes us to kind of say something about the definition of artificial life and what artificial life could be thought of, at least in terms of the disciplines that it entails. So I stole this slide and I modified it a little bit, actually, originally from the seminar by Bertwang Chak Chan. I really recommend checking his work. What I like is that he mentions wetware, hardware, and art as its own kind of segment of artificial life, and then as well software and artificial neural networks, computer simulations, and genetic algorithms as well. So there are many different ways of understanding artificial life and not necessarily just software or just art. And to give an example of a generative artist that has been working on this already way before us is Carl Sims. Maybe some of you already know his work. He created this evolved virtual creatures, and in 1994 with what back then was a supercomputer that now wouldn't be a supercomputer anymore. So it's kind of there's something interesting as well about what the definition of a supercomputer is in 1994 versus in 2021. And I guess what we really like about this project is that you can see these creatures are made out of primitives. So they are kind of cubes put together, and still, even if they are made of primitives, we can still see life in them or something that looks living. And when we look at their behavior as well, when he made these two creatures kind of compete towards a goal, so like a red cube, And there are all these strategies that emerge, you know, like one creature would go and kind of block the objective, and or another one would go and directly fight the opponent and then go for the prize. And that speaks about life, and that makes us think about life as well.
And especially here as for example, with one of our great inspirations, the Codex Serifianas by Luigi Serifiani, we see this book that I believe was published in the early 80s, and all these fantastical, nonsensical creatures and language as well, they are all somehow very familiar. And this is also something we see when we work with artificial neural networks as well, that the outputs are the sum of the knowledge. A GAN doesn't output an image it didn't learn, in the sense that if you teach a GAN about trees, it cannot tell you anything about sharks. And the same thing we see here in this work, where you see all these fantastic zoological, botanical creations, but they are, in a sense, the remixing or the recombination of a human, the artist's knowledge of botany, zoology, humans, architecture, etc., language even. And what's interesting about that is that there still exists such a variety and diversity, even when working within the realm of the known, which we find quite fascinating. And also how very quickly we go from something that seems artificial or somehow primitive to interactions or behaviors that start to resemble ecosystems and complex living systems.
Yeah, so to show kind of one example of what we are talking about here, this is a project that I've been working on for the past few years. And this is the jellyfish, one of the jellyfish that I was talking about before. And similarly, I focused on trying to generate with a convolutional neural network, using texture synthesis, try to generate these life-looking creatures, or it's kind of like biomorphs. Yeah. And eventually that wasn't enough for me. I wanted to also combine this into a physical printing technique. And I got really inspired by the work of Anna Atkins, who was a photographer and botanist. In fact, she was probably one of the first photographers ever. And she and her father worked a lot on the talbotype and the cyanotype. And she got really hooked on the cyanotype technique. And what I like is that back in the days when she worked on the cyanotypes, the only way of having visual representations of nature was by illustration. So humans had to illustrate and create an archive for botanists to be able to work with, or directly archiving drying the specimens and having an archive. But what I like is that she wanted to obtain an impression of these plants and algae themselves. And in a way, she was a pioneer of her time. So what I wanted to do with this is to apply a contemporary look onto her work. So I worked on generating these creatures, or these images of creatures, and then I printed them using the same technique. And this is a newer project that's called Artificial Natural History, and it's kind of like in a way, like the evolution of the previous project as well. I realized that what I wanted was to make a book that shows how humans saw back in the day nature, and how nature was portrayed before cameras existed and when humans had to illustrate nature. And something that's amazing that emerge, or that is visually most striking about these images for me, is that we are able to still see how we organize creatures, or we organize those patterns visually, and we put them together on a page in a coherent way. And that's what the neural network is able to learn as well. And that's another reason why I really like working with these new technologies, is that we're able to extract patterns like this, for example.
I think also, I mean, we'll be returning to this shortly, but what we often see is that we, as humans, have often developed very standardized ways of creating representations. Our scientific corpus is often built up upon the cataloging and the standardization of information. And what we often see is that while these are very beautiful and they give rise to very beautiful images, especially when sort of brought back into new, more modern technologies, at the same time, they also are in some way a disconnect or divergence away from the reality of the ecosystem from where the information came. And what happens when we start representing individual species rather than their complex entanglements. And that sort of leads us to one of our more sort of current efforts, which is our shared practice, which we've named Entangled Others, because we firmly believe that these days, especially, it's more important than ever to become aware of our actual entanglement with the world, and how, while we often experience our human sphere as somehow separate, especially the digital, somehow platonic and a different realm from the physical natural world, in fact, everything is quite tightly knit together and entangled and messily overlapping. And how do we explore that? What can we get out of that that can somehow create for us better ways of interacting and becoming more aware of our world, and therefore having different ways of seeing what's possible? So this project, Artificial Remnants, was our first real collaboration, wherein we explored how can we create three-dimensional insects to sort of like bring forth this these creatures into the digital world that were digital natives. So for us, we then had to find a data set for this, of course, and to actually find 3D models of insects from scientific sources is actually very difficult. And we realized when we were doing this, how little data there is out there and how little we can see of our natural world. So we ended up generating both 3D models and their according textures and plumage, so to speak, as well as anatomical descriptions of their various taxonomical bits. And again, this is a reflection of what is out there in information about our digital world. And a lot of it isn't in any way an actual connection to the real creature. So for us, it was very interesting to explore that slippery slope of not working with a strong data set, but rather one that reveals, in a sense, our own quite limited view of the natural world. And at the same time, when we then brought these to life in the digital space, gave them motion, allowed people to interact with them through augmented reality, they somehow again became characters that seemed to possess some kind of agency of their own, that had some potential for some kind of emotional interaction. And that is really fascinating for us, that we, even though we often exist in this platonic digital realm these days, especially now with everyone at home, at the same time, there still is that potential for natural experiences with nature. So I don't know if you'd like to add anything to that, or...
No, so that leads us to the latest project that we've been working on. It extended much longer than we originally planned for because of COVID, and it was originally going to be an exhibition. And our idea here was to move forwards from just generating one single creature or a set of creatures, but actually work on an ecosystem, and to think about the idea of existing in relationship, which is such a concept, is such an abstract concept to us, that we were actually like the whole COVID situation kind of also helped us in a way understand this, that if something bad happens to our neighbors, something bad will happen to us, probably, could happen to us, probably.
Yeah, and so when we sort of started this project, we looked into what is an ecosystem. And, you know, if you look at the Wikipedia definition, you see that it is a community of living and non-living components that are interacting to form a system. And we looked around for examples, and we landed upon the aquatic, and specifically coral reefs, because they are a fantastic example of how rich and diverse and complex and far-reaching these systems can be. They can have millions of species living in and about them. The consequences of their being, any specific place in the ocean, can have consequences for the other side of the ocean, the biodiversity there. So these are entirely essential systems, but they are so far disconnected from us. You know, we need special diving equipment just to be able to visit them. So we see that they are the perfect example of interconnectedness, that especially now with the lack of ability to travel is entirely disconnected from us directly, but at the same time, we actually rely upon a lot of their functionings for a healthy ocean. And at the same time, because of that, we ran into the same problem as before, the lack of data. We had to work with the artist Joel Simon to create synthetic coral in order to create a richer diversity of coral morphologies, simply because there is almost no data out there. And again, we could see this as a failing, because this is naturally a failed project in itself. We cannot even hope to represent a fraction of the complexity. So why on earth should we do it? Why should we try and dream up this new ecosystem? And a lot of it for us ended up becoming, how can we create that sense of meeting another in the digital space, especially these days? And how can we use this act of storytelling, and what can that do for us? So, you know, to dream up an ecosystem is to tell a story. And when we tell a story, we have to contend with the fact that we are telling something about what we know or believe. At the same time, that also implies that there is something that is unknown. And in this case, when we are working with everything from corals to jellyfish to crabs, there is so much we don't know, and there's so many diverse species out there we haven't even discovered as from a purely scientific point of view. So ultimately, we're starting to see that this is a very subjective thing, that what we see here isn't the reality of the world, because what these corals here, these three-dimensional corals, they're not corals. And they're not even a fraction of what a coral reef could be. But at the same time, they still have some quality that reminds us of that. And when we then started to combine them, to put them together, we saw that we gained a curious quality that somehow, you know, you started to feel like you were peeking through a diving bell into a world. And you had that sense of contacting something that or being in touch, or almost touching something that was alive and somehow interconnected, that they somehow began to emerge a sense of life again.
And there's also something fascinating for us about putting nature on the spotlight and putting just an abstraction, like an abstract representation of the patterns of nature on the spotlight. Yeah, so there's something that also speaks about how we learn about nature as well through natural history museums, for example, that have largely inspired both of us, I think, and kind of dissociating from that knowledge. And to link this a bit more onto design, another of the things that we're still working on, but that we really wanted to implement with this project, was working with biomaterials. And we took it kind of as a learning challenge. We wanted to learn about biomaterials through working on this exhibition too. And we faced a number of challenges by trying to cook biomaterials ourselves with the recipes that are available online, and even asking friends who work with biomaterials. Then we also faced the challenges of creating biomaterials that would rot away over the course of an exhibition, which wasn't what we wanted to do for this particular exhibition. So eventually we found a Knife Factory Lab. They're a studio based in Barcelona, and they specialized in working with materials, in particular coming from olive pits. So they work with materials that have been discarded. And what they do is, one of the materials that they create and that we love is this kind of bioplastic that can also be, they color it as well with natural colorants, and this material can be melted away and repurposed again over and over. And there's something I think amazing about the fact that we could make an exhibition and show a piece of work and then repurpose that for another future work and talk about a completely different thing. And I think that this was an educational project for us in terms of like beginning to think about this. And I see it kind of as a mission, as an artist who works with nature, to start thinking about sustainability as well.
And I think it's also, especially in the context of using machine learning in an artistic practice, you are interacting still with the natural world. Whenever you consume energy just to power your GPUs, you're interacting with the world. And especially when it's important for us to remember that all these digital layers that inform our modern world have physical consequences, and how we can try and start working with new ways, not only of exploring the limits of our own representation of the world and understanding of the world, but also how we can still transform that into a different kind of response on the physical end. And of course, this is something we're still very much in the early days of. And that's why an important part of, you know, Entangled Others is also to collaborate and to interact with others. So just as like a final note, we've been having this open call now, and it's still an open call because we're trying to find ways to engage across disciplines, to try and find ways of, you know, weaving ourselves tighter together, especially now as we're still all, you know, stuck at home. I think that this is more important than ever now, that we try and somehow become more aware and find ways to strengthen those connections and create new ones. So that's an open invitation. Please reach out to us if you feel like collaborating or interested in, you know, having a conversation or anything like that. We'd love to, you know, dive deeper into that. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting and really a masterpiece of presentation of art that you are doing. Thanks for sharing with us. I feel that this is interesting for our side, because we definitely need to know how art practitioners and people in art interact with the tools that we are all passionate about creating. And I think that in some of the previous sessions, for instance, the one is Rebecca Fibrink. She was also talking about the interaction, and even today, Jesse was talking about the interaction. And I think that this is part of the reason that, you know, knowing what you guys are thinking and also learning from you would be really beneficial for us as well. So thanks for sharing your work. Are there questions?
Yeah, I just put mine in the chat, but I guess I could say it out loud.
Yeah, please.
So throughout this presentation, I noticed that a lot of the stuff kind of like was in line with like Deleuzian perspectives and things. And so I was wondering if you guys were aware of the work of Deleuze and Guattari, or if you've just, kind of reached these kind of perspectives on your own. I mean, you even mentioned Plato. Like your rejection of Plato, I was like, all right, come on.
Fair enough, fair enough. Honestly, my philosophical training doesn't really extend that far, so I'll have to take you on surface value there, that there's a resemblance. But I think a lot of these conclusions are also quite natural to reach if you sort of like work in the way we have and the tools we have. Because we are also shaped by our tools, just like you're shaped by a pencil. When you draw, you can do some things with a pencil and not other things. And the same applies, even though it seems so much more different on a computer, we still have some of the same shaping qualities to our tools, especially when they're digital too.
I am familiar with Deleuze, and actually one of my pieces is inspired by the body without organs. So it's actually
nice.
a body just made of organs. But yeah, that's
Wait,
very much
where
in
can I
line.
like see that piece or like access it? Is it like online?
Yeah, I can share it.
All right, cool, thanks.
I'll look for it now as a link to share it. Yeah. Are there any other questions?
Or thoughts or that sort of thing,
Oh, I just found the whole talk very interesting. The images would have looked really interesting and cool to me either way, but it was nice to hear about all of the thought processes behind them. And it was also nice because all of the other talks we've had have been very focused from the computer science side, and that was more of the background. So it was interesting to hear from a more artistic perspective.
Glad to hear that. I mean, I think that's also, it's very important, especially for us. It's been very important to try and not forget that we're artists and why we do things, and to question not only the sort of technical solutions, but also the why and the how and what does it do? Because ideally, it should be accessible even if you have no background in anything technical. I think it's possible to, still demand a lot of generative and digital art in that sense, without sort of devolving to technicalities.
Yeah, and the good thing about approaching things from the perspective of art is that we can allow ourselves to really think about things and not having to be bounded by achieving something specific or achieving like a functionality. I guess that you can define just within the functionality of art itself, which that could also be seen as a functionality, but separate. In contrast with the sciences, we don't need to achieve anything in particular besides from what we want to envision. And for that reason, when very often we get asked, do you think that that algorithms can be creative and that can replace human artists? And well, we think that it's very important to also remember that it's us humans who consume art, and that art is made for us. We don't really make art to be consumed by any computer. So yeah. I shared the screenshot just because I didn't want to share, like, I have it on the gallery page, but I didn't want to share like something that looks promotional. So I just shared the screenshot of the piece of the body.
Excellent. Thank you so much to both of you, and to also the students. Are there any questions? Further questions? Okay, then with that, we thank you again and appreciate that you came to our class. I think you are in England, right?
Germany.
Germany. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. I see that
Bye-bye.
students are thanking you on the chat, and it was great.
Thank you.
Likewise.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.